Chapter 19. Craig roared a defiant laugh, his deep voice echoing within the wide-open vaults of the necropolis. His necropolis. The bellows challenged the sleeping corpses of better than 1,000 years of Keldon rulers. None answered. He growled a sharp oath, enjoying this moment among his ancestors. 3 exterior walls banked inward as they rose majestically overhead to a ceiling of polished, dark gray stone. The entire 4th side was open to the thin mountain air, as no mortal walls could hope to contain the warlords and witch kings of Kel. The scent of new snow carried in on cutting winds, the frigid grip tugging at Craig's long, dark braids and brushing an icy touch against his bare chest and arms. Thousands of tombs lined the walls, each no larger than the slab of marble on which a warlord would someday rest. Many of these were already bricked up, sealing fallen warlords into place till the final battle. A faded mural painted over the ceiling's wide expanse depicted that promised legend, the call to return, the moment that marks the end of the world, that would sound of 1,000 battle cries after the necropolis filled. The warlords would rise again to be led by the greatest of their number, an army unto themselves. They would lead the rest of the Keldon nation to war. The mural depicted the great army sweeping down from the necropolis to conquer all of Dominaria, the bright sunrise over the necropolis bathing the land red as with blood. Craig walked among the several hundred sarcophagi that rested upon the vault's floor, each trimmed in a varied measure of silver or gold, depending on the fame and prowess of the warrior within. The greatest of the Keldon leaders were these, placed lower down in the necropolis and so ready to lead the way out once the dead rose. Only here did Craig walk among his peers. Even the greatest warlords eventually came to rest here. All warlords. Except Craig. Not a question he felt able to answer with any degree of certainty. Not anymore. In his century and a half of life and warfare, Craig had never felt the mortal coils settle about him as in the last decade. Since the Dark Invaders began pushing at the edges of his nation, he felt it. Gatha knew something of them as the mage knew about nearly everything. They were beings of another world. Phyrexians, he had called them, born of nature and made over again with machine. Such ideas confused Craig's sense of the natural order where the strongest led and others followed. These Phyrexians bled and died as the same as other races. They were innumerable, perhaps, but not invincible. In 23 battles against them, Craig had yet to personally know defeat. 4 other Witch Kings with their war hosts had, though. The Keldon war hosts no longer traveled out into Dominaria except on the very rare and highly paid expedition. It was only enough to support the nation, if barely, as the majority remained home and continued to fight the Dark Ones. Craig tracked the battles over 50 years, at first beginning only with minor raids and probing maneuvers. Those attacks gradually stepped up in strength until no other nation on Dominaria could have matched such an enemy. The Keldons remained battle-ready, even in their own homes, their lands having always served as a large armed camp. The mountains were known to them, comfortable to them. No one could hope to fight as well in this territory. And they were losing. The Keldons were not in danger of being completely overrun, though Craig believed that the invader could do so if they wish. He understood warfare like nothing else, and he recognized a purpose in the enemy attacks. They had spent decades learning the Keldon strengths and weaknesses, as if 1,000 dead, even 10,000, meant nothing while probing at those depths. They turned heavier strength against the foundations of Keld, destroying the best of the Witch Kings, those on which Craig relied and whom Gatha had named as his superior bloodlines. This was a purposeful campaign to isolate the two, slowly dismantling the work of a century and a half. One by one, the Witch Kings finally succumbed, until only he was left to hold the nation together. Craig, the Witch King. Craig, the Immortal. Craig, who had come to the necropolis to visit his own crypt. Made of obsidian, it was glassy and mirror-like in its thousands of facets. The small building was trimmed in heavy gold with weapons adorning outside and inside walls both. A gate of wrought iron barred entry but allowed for viewing within. A hanging rack for his armor occupied one corner, and the sarcophagus waited with lid half drawn as it had for 100 years. No similar structure decorated the vaults, just as there had never been a warlord such as he. It had been built a century before, on his order, right at the very lip of the vaults. Built where Craig knew he could hurl a spear out over the edge and have it not smash into the ground for a good half-mile drop or more, depending on the winds. The warlord had never thought to occupy that crypt, knowing within himself that no Dominarian could ever hope to kill him. He had been right. The Phyrexians weren't Dominarian. Fingers wrapped into his iron bars of the crypt door, the cold metal sticking to his warm skin. Craig ground his teeth in fury. 150 years of experience promised him that the enemy would come for him soon. For Gatha, he both. His warrior instinct drove him to fight, and he would, the head of the largest combined war host the Keldan nation had ever known. An event which would survive centuries of retelling. It would be known in the oral histories until the day the call to return finally sounded. His muscles bunched and strained, his mortal limits set against the metal and stone. Coarse, threaded screws set into a mortared jam wrenched free. He yelled his anger, defiance, in a guttural shout. The iron gate twisted and came away in his hands. He held it overhead with another savage cry, pitched it from the lip of the necropolis out into the thin, frozen air. He heard it whistle away, fade, and be lost. It fell down far enough that he never heard it hit. That sat well with Craig. Let it be lost. If he was ever to be laid to rest here, it would not be within the confines which could be built by man, not even Keldan man. Rough blankets draped most of the equipment in Gatha's labs. Gray shrouds, rank with Kolos sweat, having been used as saddle blankets in the past. Gatha hated that scent, even after 3 centuries in Keld, where the musk of the mountain animals seemed to permeate every facet of life. Wondered if the Keldans hated the large beasts as much. Shrugged and shook his head, dispelling his speculation, along with any lingering aversion to the scent. Didn't matter anymore. Craig had been to see him at the first of the week, carefully talking around the very point the Witch King had come to make. It was something that couldn't be put into words. What Gatha had feared for 50 years, the Phyrexians, were coming. And this time, there'd be no stopping them. Standing still and silent, Gatha strained his hearing to catch the sounds of the battle being fought on the plateau below his laboratory. No fire crackled in competition, no slaves moved about doing his bidding, where their footsteps might have drowned out the distant ringing of metal against metal. There were only he and 2 guards who waited like motionless statues outside his main workspace while he prepared it. The fighting sounded as if it had moved closer. Gatha could hear the shrill cry of a wounded Kolos war beast echoing up the mountainside. It was drowned out immediately by the grating roar of a massive Phyrexian dragon engine. It was the sound of death knocking upon the gates, an Argivian saying which Gatha remembered from long before Keld or Tolaria. Strange that deep down he actually believed death would come politely, requesting admission rather than kicking down the barriers and falling upon its victim in a fury of fire when grinding metal. Well, Gatha did not intend to quit without a fight. He had been forced to flee Tolaria, betrayed by those he had called colleagues, even when they did not deserve such praise. Here he knew strong allies, the strength of his own powers. Craig had never failed him, never failed the Keldan nation, and Gatha knew that any chance for victory would revolve around them both, warlord and tutor, witch king and wizard. Gatha remembered much of the Tolarian histories, of the battles waged with the dark forces. He knew many of their weaknesses. He could help turn the tide in battle, perhaps. In case he could not, the lab required preparation. Moving around the room, Gatha continued to cover each piece of equipment with the rough, strong-smelling blankets as he wrapped them with magical energies drawn from the mountains of Keld. He pulled the mana from the land, feeling its raw power and knowing the destructive force such energies could bring about. Warmth flushed his skin pink, warding him against the room's severe chill as he layered the magic into every device, every table, into each wall surrounding him. It pulsed at his temples, straining for release, but he held each strand tied into a simple knot at the center of his mind. He buried it deep down, and there he held it with an afterthought. So long as he lived, his labs were safe, but at any moment he could bring them down. He would not allow his work to fall into the hands of such an enemy. Better that it go to Urza, who had appreciated Gatha's efforts for many years. He wondered what Urza might be able to accomplish with the culmination of Gatha's 3 centuries of research. Great things, certainly. His previous casting completed, the mage stepped over to a large iron-bound trunk. The dark ebony paneling had been carved with scenes out of classic literature, each one depicting the gift or acquiring of knowledge from the gods or through man's own effort. Gatha had been known for both in his years in Keld. Inside the trunk was every scrap of information he had collected. Early theories and experiments, 200 years of refinement, his book of questions, as he called it, new paths of exploration suggested by his work, and many problems he had run up against or simply considered but had never possessed the time to pursue. Always time, his hated enemy, working against him. What he might have accomplished, eventually. Gatha smiled in the face of that consideration. What he had accomplished today. Thinking back on his time in Tolaria, Gatha felt for the magic inherent to the island and drew it for his use. It came in a cool, salt-laden breeze. He attached tendrils of the power to the trunk, and with a simple twist of his mind, he transported the entire collection into a fissure deep within the ground. There, it would await Urza, the only person Gatha knew who could possibly retrieve it and figure out how to unlock its contents without engaging the protective wards that would incinerate the research. The lab dead and warded, the trunk hidden away with only a tether held in his mental grasp, Gatha picked up his staff from its resting place by the main door. Made of dark ebony as its trunk had been, its headpiece a pair of crescent-shaped iron blades, stained a deep crimson. It was no longer the simple walking staff he had used to enter Keld, a magical device he had imbued with powers over his long stay that would aid him today in defending his home. Passing through the door, he gathered his guards by glance alone, then added that final magical tendril, connecting his boon of knowledge to the knot of magical threads already tied within his mind. He was ready to search out and whisper a message to Urza Planeswalker. It would bring Urza here, eventually. What happened after, in the future, was not Gatha's concern. Never was. Craig commanded his war host from the left flank, near the edge of the plateau where the fighting was the most concentrated. Here there could be no quarter, no fallback, the opposing forces always aware of the precipice they could so easily be swept over. Already a number of Keldon warriors had plummeted to their deaths, dashed to crimson stains in the sharp rocks below. Craig had led an assault which toppled a dragon engine to join them. His greatsword sliced apart treads while a white scar of lightning cast out from Gatha's fingertips slammed into the engine's enraged head. The stench, oil and blood, scorched the ground and burnt flesh, assailed the normally chill mountain air now warm with Phyrexian fires. Craig registered the pain of his healing right leg. The Witch King's armor had been burned away from a gout of burning jelly-like substance belched from one of the larger black creatures, that creature now destroyed and left in his wake. Armor-clad warriors, those stunted growths with their mechanical arms and legs, left shattered by the dozens. They annoyed him, so small and insignificant compared to his expanded boundaries. His was the personal strength of 1,000 men, borrowed piecemeal from the legion of warriors under his direct control. When he swung his gore-streaked greatsword, it struck with force enough to rip through armor plating, shatter metal supports. Flesh and bone where he found it among the dark soldiers, he cleft with ease. How much more might he have become if he had brought the entire Keldon war host under his banner? It was not the only battle being fought today. It was one of several, in fact. The Witch King never forgot his responsibilities. He was more than Krieg, mortal or not. The greatest of the Witch Kings, or not, was Keld. Even in the frenzy of battle, the Witch King never forgot his priorities. His nation would survive. The Phyrexians were here for him, testing themselves against the greatest warrior Dominaria had ever known. He and Gatha, they were the objectives. So long as Craig did not put the whole of Keld in between the enemy and themselves, many, would survive. The warlord was able to easily recognize the Phyrexians' battle philosophy. They had apparently little use for subterfuge with what seemed to be inexhaustible resources to draw upon. And they had their god, pale flesh and black eyes that could place them for battle or withdraw them as necessary. They wanted to rip out the strength, what they perceived to be the strength, of his nation. They would learn that the Keldon strength was inexhaustible as well. It didn't matter whether the Phyrexians won today or next year. They could take all of Dominaria, in fact. One day, the necropolis would be full, and nothing would stand before his nation and him. A skeletal figure walked the battlefield toward him. Craig knew of it immediately. Sensing the approaching danger in the waning life force of his warriors, it appeared only slightly more impressive than the spindle-limbed warriors in black armor, the only visible differences being its cleft skull and burning red eyes that sat back within hollow sockets. It carried a staff which looked to be a thin, twisted piece of wood and wore no more protection than a robe of tattered cloth bands, or so it seemed. One Keldon warrior charged the thing and moved with blinding speed to eviscerate the man with one swipe of its thin, taloned hands. Another met an end with searing bolts from the creature's eyes. The one blow Craig saw the creature take was shrugged aside as easily as the Witch King himself might have done, hardly scratching through the tattered robes that writhed with their own life. Rage gripped Craig, watching his warriors so easily cast aside as if they barely merited a warrior's death. He kicked an impaled creature off his sword. The warlord shouldered his way past or through several skirmishes, trailing the smoke from smoldering Kolos horn back from his shoulder vents. Phyrexian's clawed hand took them off the bladed antler that guarded part of his helm's eye slit. He shrugged it aside, raking his armor's elbow spikes into the creature's midsection, tearing through several hoses, acting as veins for thin, glistening oil. The other creature finally noticed his advance, paused to meet him. It screeched out an attack of tormenting sound. Waves of preternatural sound assailed Craig, stunning force as if it hit an invisible wall, which then toppled him back over. His armor shook and small stabs of pain worked through his gut. He shouted his war cry, cursing his own muscles for their treasonous behavior. Then he was past the wall and set upon Phyrexian. His greatsword rose and fell 3 times in rapid strikes. The first 2 glanced off the bands of metal that rustled and rasped over the creature like living snakes, but the last connected solidly to the side of the Phyrexian's head. A few metal bands fell to the ground, writhing a moment before falling still. The vicious slash to the creature's face caused it to stumble, opened a large cut in the taut, glistening gray skin. Craig moved to make a disabling blow, but found his sword deflected by a flick of the creature's hand. A stiff-arm stabbing motion followed from the Phyrexian, allowing a pair of talons to pierce his armor and dig into his ribs. Craig backed off immediately, knowing not to press an attack after being taken unaware, and he watched the cut on the Phyrexian's face heal. Strands of fiber spun out from one side of the wound to the other, pulling the flesh tight again. Small spinning devices fused right into the skull, it seemed, spun and stitched the skin back together flawlessly. His own wounds burned painfully. He noticed a sludge-like black fluid dripping from the creature's 2 talons that had found his skin. Growling defiance, Craig swung again. Another lightning flash of motion, the Phyrexian's poisoned claws scored again along his right shoulder. Burning, the substance continued to eat away at him, regardless of how much strength his warriors lent him. Craig stumbled, going down on one knee, his sword point stabbed into the earth for balance. He hated the Phyrexian for humbling him in such a manner. He couldn't draw a breath, the burning now in his lungs. Craig wrenched his helm away, drawing in deeply the steaming, smoking air. Chattering a cacophony of squeals and hisses, the creature moved in to deal a death blow. A crackling, snapping arc of energy scored the air over Craig. Gatha's lightning caught the Phyrexian in the shoulder, driving it back a step as 2 more warriors fell on it. One arm apparently fused into place, the beast clawed the throat out of one foot soldier, then threw him onto his partner, driving them both over the cliff edge. It then worked at its shoulder, twisting it back into a full range of motion within seconds. With a struggle to control his pain, Craig levered himself up, back to his feet, brought his greatsword back up in a challenge. He could feel his own blood trickling down his side, the wounds failing to close as the burning sludge worked deeper into his body. The Phyrexian advanced, striking out with long skeletal arms that moved with blazing speed. Craig countered, giving back a step under each blow, but holding off the deadly embrace. More of his warriors leapt into the fray, only to be thrown back dead or dying, and then the creature advanced again. Craig knew that the space behind him was limited. There would be Gatha, then open air as the plateau fell away into the lower valleys. He would have to act soon. The Phyrexian never gave him that chance. As if tired of the game, it simply grabbed his sword on a parrying stroke, wrested it from his grip. A razor claw shot out, piercing his armor and digging claws into his midsection. It lifted Craig from the ground, its hollow sockets only inches from the Witch King's tortured gaze, as it pumped more liquid fire into him, that it tossed both Keldon Warlord and sword aside as if broken toys. Craig slammed into the ground, and there he lay, in wordless agony, so easily discarded. The greatest Witch King ever known rolled over enough to see the face of his destroyer. He stared into the skull's lifeless expression. The Phyrexian turned, no longer concerned with the broken Keldon. Its ember eyes found Gatha. Hellfire's sense of burning flesh and scorched ground rose to choke Gatha. Metal clattered against other metal. The grinding of gears at times threatened to drown out the orders passed him on minor warlords and their Witch King masters. A haze hung out over the plateau, smoky and wraith-like, and from that haze the Phyrexians kept advancing. Warriors went down beneath physical weapons and blazes of energies, and some simply fell sick as if by sudden disease. Craig fell to the Phyrexian champion. The shock value itself drove the Keldon army back several precious yards. Gatha could not wonder if he hadn't somehow been responsible. The more magic he expended, it seemed, the greater the opposition brought forward by the Phyrexians. His cast of lightning helping to topple a dragon engine, and then two more of the Juggernauts rolled forward. He'd summoned a giant at one point, which had been quickly overwhelmed under a surge of black-armored warriors. Then came the particularly draining cast, drawing upon his entire store of mana to summon a rock hydra to block the lower pass, trying to limit the influx of more enemy soldiers. The Phyrexians countered with their god. The mage had glimpsed him in between castings while trying to marshal the energies at his control for another lightning strike. The image fit Craig's description too well, pasty, corpse-like flesh and wide-set eyes of steel, gray within black. The thin, hard line of his mouth grimaced under strain. Gatha did not believe the figure was actually a god, no more than he himself was, though the Keldons had for decades considered him and Craig both as near divine. He sensed the bridge form between worlds, saw briefly the dull tan landscape overlaid onto Dominaria. Planeswalker. The word shouted out in his mind from an earlier association with Urza. It was the closest he could come to naming the power he saw demonstrated. From across the bridge stepped a new group of Phyrexian nightmares, the skeletal figure among them, bypassing the Hydra. Urza, help us, was Gatha's first thought at witnessing the crossover. He could have hoped to shout for the Planeswalker's attention. Right then, he would have done so. But he had spent too much of his stamina already, manipulating heavy magics as well as maintaining his hold on the wards that protected his labs. Now he could only try to recover, witnessing the horrible passage of the new Phyrexian as it slaughtered its way quickly and effortlessly across the battlefield to put down Craig. Even a solid strike of lightning failed to do more than slow it, draw its attention. Right then, as it looked at him before its final confrontation with Craig, Gatha sensed the hatred it felt. It froze the mage in his place for a moment, long enough for Craig to fall. Then the dark creature was past the dethroned Witch King, facing Gatha himself. Backed against the plateau's precipice, his magical strength waning, Gatha began a sacrificial casting that would expend his own life in one final attack against the Phyrexian. One of the most powerful and dangerous spells he'd brought away from Tolaria. He held it in reserve just for such an occasion. With Craig vanquished and the army poised at its breaking point, there was little else he could accomplish with his life. He could only hope to accomplish something more by his death. Time betrayed him. The creature's red eyes darkened, becoming twin orbs of dark power within cavernous sockets. The black mana swept from it in a mind-rending wave, a banshee wail that drove the mage quickly to his knees. The spell he had held in the readiness was lost to the chaos, torn from him in a painful struggle. It left him weak and defenseless. He rose back to his feet on shaky legs, his mind numb. He stared into the orbs, and they froze him to his spot. The Phyrexian reached its hands out toward Gatha's head, razor-sharp fingers on hands of metal framework and cable. One finger on each hand opened up to allow a short length of braided wire to escape, the ends probing the air in front of his eyes, searching. Gatha realized that all his preparations to keep his research from Phyrexian hands were for naught, and worse, he was about to give up Urza's best-kept secrets. Tolaria, the Weatherlight, the Legacy, the Bloodlines. He understood now. The Phyrexian was here for his mind. His entire life, Gatha had always lived by what could be done now, not tomorrow or the next day. Leaving his knowledge for Urza's recovery was in many ways an act of today, though it also prepared for the morrow when that knowledge might surface again. Seconds away from betrayal of Dominaria to Phyrexia, Gatha made the final commitment. Gauging his distance from the plateau's drop to a deep valley, Gatha released that buried knot of magical energy within his mind, collapsing the wards that protected his lab and held the call for Urza in place. Far up the slope from the plateau, fire blossomed up as the destructive force of the mountain's stored mana welled up in a cataclysm of energy and raw power meant to destroy his labs completely. The roar of the explosion was matched with a magical shockwave which rode the recoil of such a heavy mana draw. The creature glanced away for a second. It was all the time Gatha required. Craig had watched the Phyrexian advance on Gatha, his jaw clenched against the pain and refusing to give it justice through voice. His friend and advisor stood transfixed like a bird caught in the mesmerizing stare of a rock cobra. Craig rolled to his stomach, ignoring the fire that burned within as he got his hands under him. His helm laying off to the side, Craig's face pressed into the ground. It smelled of fresh dirt, no oil or blood to taint the ground of Keld here. No scorched earth. Not yet. The sweat of exertion tunneling from his brow, Craig levered himself back to his hands and knees. He still maintained his hold on the warhost, still felt their combined strength and rage coursing through his veins as it warred with the foreign substance invading his body. He focused on the back of the creature that had laid him low. He saw the sky over the invader's shoulder deepening into purple as his bloodlust mixed with the normal blue. He rocked back to his feet as Gatha shrank to his knees, the two trading places. He stumbled for his greatsword, drawing it back from the dust where the Phyrexian had cast it. The Keldan nation was not finished. Neither was he. The powers of the Witch King were never without their limitations, even in him. He drew from his warrior nation that which he needed to make himself stronger and gifted back to them in his exploits and energy a lust for life and battle which would carry them through and home again with the spoils of war. Only here the spoils were Keld itself. He could feel the dark matter killing him. Certainly would have killed any mortal man already. Craig had never known defeat before, but if it must happen, it would happen on his own terms. The explosion of Gatha's labs did not distract the Witch King's focus. He saw Gatha pitch himself backwards, rolling for the cliff edge. The Phyrexian recovered quickly, but not soon enough. Gatha was lost in the vast space that fell away from the plateau. Cheering his friend, defying death to hands of Phyrexia, the Witch King leapt forward, sword reversed, poised overhead like a scorpion stinger, the battle cry on his lips, his own. Craig! The skeletal creature spun quickly, arms flashing in an attack. Craig drove forward in deadly embrace, talons ripped through armor like a sword through old leather, digging deeply into each side. Pain blossomed, agony unlike he had ever known or imagined. Craig retained hold of his weapon with determination, honed over 150 years of battle, and he felt his steel bite at the joints, with the creature's thin neck met with the armored bands covering its shoulders. Screaming his war cry, Craig drove the blade down with every ounce of strength, kicked forward. The blade worked in and plunged deep, driven by the strength of every warrior, and still survived the raging will of one mortal who would never surrender easily to death. The Phyrexian screeched in pain and fury, then caught him fast, trying to hold Craig in a final embrace. No physical barriers held a Keldan warlord, not even after death. Craig drove forward, bloody spittle flying from his lips as he screamed his own name. His vision swam, and he stood at the entrance to his crypt facing out into the world, the drop before him leading down from the necropolis. With his final call to battle, rousing those who woke behind him, Craig leapt out into the space. As he fell, he knew that somewhere, down below, Gatha waited for him again.